Why did Venezuela, a country which had been lifted up as the prime example of how socialism could work, collapse so catastrophically that its people are now poorer than they were 70 years ago? Now, most people might point to Hugo Chavez and say, well, that's why. It was this dictator guy. And while Chavez absolutely accelerated things, the truth is actually far more shocking. Because Venezuela didn't vote for socialism once, it actually voted for it twice without realizing it. The first time was by accident. They thought they were voting for capitalism, but the second time was absolutely on purpose. They thought socialism would fix the very problems that socialism had created and then blamed on capitalism. So to understand how a country goes from being one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America to almost a failed state in the span of a few decades, you have to go much further back than Chavez. Way further, back to 1958, when Venezuela had actually transitioned into a stable democracy and become the envy of the developing world. At that time, oil money was pouring in and the middle class was booming. And for a while, it genuinely looked like Venezuela had discovered some sort of secret formula for success. The bolivar was one of the strongest currencies in the region. People were immigrating to Venezuela, not fleeing from it. And from the outside, it looked like a capitalist success story. But under the surface, something else was happening. The government kept taking over industries. It piled on subsidies. It froze prices. It expanded the welfare state year after year. It wasn't quite the overt socialism of Chavez or Maduro, at least not openly, but it also wasn't capitalism. It was a creeping form of state control as Venezuelans continued to vote for themselves generous welfare benefits that were paid out from the country's oil revenues, which were nationalized in 1976. And this is the moment people always overlook, because this, right here, is when everything began to fall apart. Not when Chavez took office, not when the economy crashed in the 2010s. It started decades earlier, at the exact moment Venezuela thought it had become rich enough to ignore the laws of economics. Because once oil prices dropped in the 1980s, the social democratic dream evaporated. GDP per capita fell an average of 1% per year from 1979 to 1999. In 1983, Venezuela experienced its first major currency devaluation. Inflation and poverty both surged as real wages collapsed. And the government responded to the crisis with the same instincts it had developed over the previous 20 years, with more price controls, more subsidies, more nationalizations, and more state intervention. Then, in 1989, everything boiled over. The Caracazo riots erupted as the government tried to scale back subsidies and raise fuel prices to deal with the crisis. The result was hundreds, possibly even thousands, were killed in the riots. And the most important thing to understand about this moment is that Venezuelans blamed the wrong culprit. They blamed capitalism, neoliberalism, or market greed. But the system that had failed them wasn't capitalism. It was decades of hidden socialism propped up by oil wealth. And when it collapsed under its own weight, Venezuelans assumed the opposite of what was actually true. They believed their country had been failed by capitalism, not state control. What happened next was almost predictable. The 1990s saw a decade of bank failures, corruption scandals, and 2 coup attempts by none other than Hugo Chavez. The old political parties had completely lost legitimacy. Living standards kept falling. People felt betrayed, abandoned, and desperate for someone who promised to tear down the old system. And this is where the tragedy truly begins. Because Venezuelans weren't rejecting capitalism. They were rejecting a failing socialist system they thought was capitalism. So when Chavez promised a revolution, millions believed he was offering them something new. But he wasn't. He was offering the exact same model that had already been failing for decades. The only difference was that the minute he took power, he turned the dial up all the way with even more nationalizations, price controls, currency manipulations, subsidies, and money printing. The result is the disaster that Venezuelans are currently living with. GDP has completely collapsed, the bolivar became worthless, food and medicine started to vanish, and millions have fled the country. Perhaps one of the most tragic parts when we see all these news stories is we have to come to the conclusion that millions of people in Venezuela willingly voted themselves into a crisis that they're now beginning to realize they can't vote themselves out of. But what's so often left out of the conversation is that Venezuela didn't collapse just because they tried socialism once. It collapsed because they tried it twice. The first time was quiet and even democratic, while the second was loud and totalitarian. And all the while, the people thought they were voting against a system that had failed them, when in reality, they were simply voting for the final stage of an ideology that had been failing them all along.